not the ceremony, not the rituals, not even the emotions that come with it, but everything leading up to it. The decisions, the expectations, the conversations, the pressure of doing things right. And honestly, all of that was a lot. But no one really talks about what comes after, the quiet part. The moment when everything settles and suddenly you're sitting there thinking, okay, now what? That's exactly where I was. Married, everything done, people gone. Phones finally silent after days of nonstop notifications. And for the first time in a while, there was no next immediate task waiting, just space. And in that space, a very simple question showed up. Where are we going for our honeymoon? It sounds small, almost exciting, like something you'd already have planned months in advance. That's what I thought too. But we didn't. Not because we didn't care. Because everything else took over. Every conversation was about the wedding. Every decision was about logistics. And somehow this one thing, the one thing that was supposed to be just about us, got pushed aside. So now we were here, married, and completely undecided. I remember looking at her that evening. We were both sitting quietly, still slightly exhausted, still processing everything that had just happened over the past few days. She smiled and asked casually, "So where are you taking me?" And I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had no answer. Not even a starting point. I had thought about it before, of course I had. But not seriously, just random ideas that never turned into actual plans. And now, suddenly, it mattered. Because this wasn't just a trip. It was our first trip together as a married couple. That sounds like a big thing when you say it out loud, and that's exactly what made it complicated. Because now, it wasn't just about picking a place. It felt like choosing something meaningful. Something that sets the tone. Something we'll remember years later. And that's where the confusion started. At first, I did what most people do. I opened my phone, typed best honeymoon destinations, and instantly regretted it. Too many options, too many opinions, too many perfect places. Beaches, mountains, cities, international, domestic, luxury, adventure, peaceful, romantic. Every option sounded right. And at the same time, none of them felt like the answer. I showed her a few options. She looked at them, smiled, and said, "They all look nice, but what do you want?" That question made it worse. Because now, I wasn't just choosing a destination. I was choosing something that reflects us. And suddenly, I realized something. I didn't know how we travel. Not really. We had spent time together. We had gone out. We had shared moments. But this was different. This wasn't a few hours. This wasn't a day. This was time. Real time. Together. Without interruption. Without distractions. And that made the decision feel bigger than it should have. Because I wasn't just choosing a place. I was choosing an experience. Do we want something quiet or something exciting? Do we want to explore or just relax? Do we want something new or something comfortable? I looked at her again. She didn't seem stressed about it. She wasn't overthinking it the way I was. She just sat there, calm, like she was waiting for me to figure it out. And that made me realize something else. Maybe this wasn't about finding the perfect place. Maybe it was about understanding what we actually need right now. Not what looks good, not what people recommend, not what sounds impressive, just what fits us. But even that wasn't easy to answer, because we were still adjusting to something new. Marriage doesn't change everything instantly, but it changes something. A quiet shift, a sense of we that wasn't there before in the same way. And now, this trip was our first real experience inside that shift. That's why it felt important. Not because of the destination, because of what it represents. I closed my phone, put it aside, and just sat there. She looked at me and said, "You're overthinking this, aren't you?" I smiled, because she was right. I was, and I didn't even realize how much. She added softly, "Why don't we just decide what kind of feeling we want, not the place?" That stopped me for a second, because that was simple. And somehow, I hadn't thought of it that way. Not a destination, a feeling. Do we want peace? Do we want fun? Do we want quiet time? Do we want memories? And suddenly the question didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear, because places are just locations. What matters is what you experience there, and that depends more on you than the place itself. I looked at her and asked, "What do you want it to feel like?" She thought for a moment. Not long. Just enough. Then she said, I just want it to feel like it's really ours, not something we picked because it looked good online. That was it. That was the answer. Not specific, but real. And for the first time since we started thinking about this, I wasn't confused anymore. Because now I wasn't looking for the best place. I was looking for something that fits us. And that changed everything. That one line stayed with me longer than anything else she said that evening. Not the destinations we had briefly looked at. Not the ideas we had half discussed. Just that one simple thought. I just wanted to feel like it's really ours. At first, it sounded easy, almost too easy. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized how different that approach actually was. Because up until that moment, I had been thinking about the honeymoon the way most people do, like something that needs to look right, something that fits a certain image. A beach, a sunset, a luxury room, perfect pictures, something you can say out loud and people immediately go, wow, that's amazing. But she wasn't thinking like that. She wasn't thinking about how it looks. She was thinking about how it feels, and those two things are not the same. That changed how I started looking at everything. I picked up my phone again, but this time I wasn't searching for best honeymoon destinations. I just opened a notes app, and I wrote one thing at the top. What do we want to feel? It looked simple, but answering it wasn't immediate, so I didn't rush it. I just sat there for a bit and started thinking honestly, not about what sounds good, about what actually feels right. The past few weeks had been a lot. Constant movement, people everywhere. Noise, decisions, expectations. Smiling even when you're tired. Talking even when you just want quiet. And even though it was all meaningful, it was still exhausting. So the first thing that came to mind was peace. Not silence in a boring way. Just space. The kind where you wake up without a schedule. The kind where you don't have to rush anywhere. The kind where you can just sit somewhere and not feel like you're wasting time. I wrote that down. Then I thought about something else. I didn't want this trip to feel like an escape from life. I wanted it to feel like the beginning of something. Not separate from reality. Connected to it. Something we carry forward. That mattered more than I expected, because I didn't want it to be just a temporary break. I wanted it to feel like a starting point. So I added that too. Then I thought about her. Not what I want. What she would enjoy. And that's where it became clearer. She doesn't need constant activity. She doesn't need something loud or flashy. She values presence, simplicity, meaning. And I realized if we went somewhere overly busy, overly structured, overly planned, it would have feel like ours. It would feel like something we're trying to keep up with. And that's exactly what we didn't need. So I wrote one more thing. Unrushed. That word felt important. More important than any destination. Because it described exactly what we needed. Time that doesn't feel pressured. Moments that don't feel scheduled. A space where we don't have to think about what's next. Just be where we are. I looked at the list. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Peace. A beginning. Unrushed. And suddenly I could already picture the kind of place that would fit that. Not a crowded city. Not somewhere packed with activities every hour. Not somewhere where we'd feel like we have to do everything to make it worth it. Something quieter, something slower, something that lets you settle into it. I showed her what I wrote. She read it, looked up at me, and smiled in that quiet way she does when something feels right to her. This is exactly it, she said. And for the first time since we started thinking about this, it felt easy. Not because we picked a place, because we understood what we were looking for. And once you know that, the place almost chooses itself. We started talking again. But this time the conversation was different. We weren't debating options. We were narrowing down feelings. Mountains came up. Not because they're popular. Because they're calm. Beaches came up too. But not crowded ones. Some were quieter, less commercial, more open. Then we talked about distance. Not too far. Not too complicated. Because the journey itself shouldn't feel stressful. That matters more than people realize. If getting there is exhausting, it takes away from what you're going for. So we agreed on something simple, a place that feels calm, a journey that feels easy, and a stay that doesn't demand anything from us. No strict plans, no fixed schedule, just space. We didn't finalize the destination that night. And surprisingly, that didn't bother me, because now it didn't feel like a decision we were struggling with. It felt like something that would naturally fall into place, And that's exactly what happened over the next couple of days. Instead of searching randomly, we started noticing places that matched what we had written, places that felt right, not just looked good. And when we found one, we both felt it, without needing to convince each other, without needing to compare it with 10 other options. It just clicked, not because it was perfect, because it fit. That's when I understood something clearly. Choosing a honeymoon isn't about finding the best place in the world. It's about finding a place that reflects what you need right now. And what we needed wasn't luxury, wasn't excitement, wasn't something impressive. We needed each other, without noise, without pressure, without distraction. And once we understood that, everything else became simple. We booked it, closed the discussion, and for the first time since the wedding ended, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, not relief, just clarity. Because now this trip didn't feel like something we had to get right. It felt like something we were already ready for. And that made all the difference. Once the booking was done, I expected to feel something big. Excitement, relief, maybe even that typical finally it's happening kind of feeling people talk about. But it didn't come like that. What I felt instead was quiet, not empty, not underwhelming, just calm. And at first, I didn't understand it, because usually when you finalize something important, there's a reaction, a shift, something noticeable. But this didn't feel like something I had just decided. It felt like something that had already settled inside me, and I had just caught up to it. That's when I realized something. We didn't rush into this decision. We didn't force it. We didn't pick something just to be done with it. We understood it first. And because of that, the decision didn't feel like a decision. It felt like alignment. That's a different experience. I looked at her after we booked it. She wasn't overly excited either. She was just content, like she had been expecting this outcome. Not the place specifically, the feeling of clarity. She said softly, "This feels right." And I didn't need anything more than that, because that's exactly what it felt like. Not perfect, just right. That night we didn't talk much about the trip. And that was another thing I noticed. Usually after booking something like this, people start planning immediately. What to do there, where to go, what to see. But we didn't. There was no rush to fill it with plans, no need to structure it, because we had already decided something more important. We weren't going there to do things, we were going there to be. And that changed everything. The next few days passed quietly. The usual routine started coming back. People still calling, work slowly returning, life settling into its normal pace again. But something inside me felt different. Not in the dramatic way, just lighter. There was no pending decision in the background anymore. No constant thought of, we still need to figure this out. It was done. And because it was done in the right way, it didn't leave any doubt behind. I also noticed something else. I wasn't thinking about the honeymoon in terms of the place anymore. I wasn't imagining the hotel, or the view, or what we would do there. I was thinking about us, what it would feel like to just sit somewhere without interruption, to wake up without a schedule, to not have to be anywhere, to not have to explain anything, just exist in that space together. And that thought felt enough, more than enough. I realized then how much we had needed this, not just a trip, a pause, because everything leading up to the wedding had been full of people, full of expectations, full of movement, and even though it was meaningful, it didn't leave much room for stillness. This trip was that stillness, and I could feel that before we even left. That's when I understood something clearly. The value of this honeymoon wasn't in where we were going, it was in what we were stepping away from, and what we were stepping into. We weren't escaping life. We were creating space inside it. That's a different kind of experience, and I could already feel the effect of it, even before it began. A few days before the trip, she asked me something. Simple. "Are you excited?" I paused for a second, not because I didn't know the answer, because I wanted to say it honestly. "I'm not excited in a loud way," I said. "I just feel ready." She nodded, like she understood exactly what that meant, and that's when it hit me again. This isn't about excitement, it's about alignment. When something is aligned, it doesn't create noise, it creates clarity, and clarity feels quiet, but strong. That's what this felt like. The day before we left, I packed my bag. Not in a rush, not last minute like I usually do. Calmly, almost without thinking. And I noticed something. I wasn't overpacking. I wasn't trying to prepare for every possible situation. I was just packing what felt necessary. That reflected something deeper. I wasn't trying to control this experience. I was trusting it, and that made everything feel lighter, even the small things. That night, we sat together again, similar to the night when we first talked about where to go. But this time, there was no confusion, no questions, no decisions waiting, just stillness. And I realized something in that moment. The honeymoon had already started. Not physically, but internally, because the shift had already happened. We had already moved into that space of us, without distractions, without pressure, without needing to figure anything out. The trip was just going to extend that, not create it. That's when everything made sense. Most people think the honeymoon is where everything begins. But for us, it had already begun. In the way we chose it, in the way we understood what we needed, in the way we didn't rush, didn't force, didn't overcomplicate something simple. That's what made it ours. And that's what mattered. The next morning, as we got ready to leave, I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't feel like I was stepping into something unknown. I just felt steady, like I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what felt right, with the right person. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing in my mind that needed to be figured out. Everything was already clear. And that clarity was the best start we could have asked for. The journey itself didn't feel like a transition. That's what stood out the most. Usually when you travel, there's a sense of movement, leaving one phase behind and stepping into another. Airports, roads, stations, they all carry that feeling of going somewhere. But this didn't feel like that. It felt like a continuation, like we weren't leaving anything behind. We were just extending something that had already begun. Even on the way there was no rush, no unnecessary conversation just to pass time, no distractions to fill silence. We talked when we felt like it. We stayed quiet when we didn't. And somehow, that balance felt natural, not planned, not controlled, just happening. I noticed how different that felt compared to how I usually travel. Normally, there's a part of me that stays slightly alert, thinking ahead, checking things, making sure everything is on track. But this time, that layer was missing. Not because I ignored it, because it wasn't needed. Everything felt simple. And when things feel simple, your mind doesn't try to complicate them. You just move with them. When we finally reached, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden feeling of, this is it. Just a quiet arrival. We stepped into a place that felt exactly like what we had imagined. Not because it matched pictures, because it matched the feeling we had defined. Calm, open, unrushed. There was space. Not just physically, internally. And I could feel it immediately. Not in an overwhelming way. In a subtle, steady way. Like something inside me had slowed down without effort. We checked in, settled in, and for a while, we didn't do anything. No exploring. No planning. No trying to make the most of it. We just sat, and that moment, that simple, quiet moment, felt more complete than anything else we could have planned. That's when it became real. This is what we came for. Not the place. Not the activities. This. Being there. Together. Without anything pulling our attention away. I looked at her. She wasn't trying to capture the moment. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't thinking ahead. She was just present. And that presence made everything feel grounded. Real. Uncomplicated. We didn't rush to step out. We didn't feel like we needed to start anything, because nothing needed to start. We were already in it. That's when I understood something deeper. Most of the time we think experiences begin when we do something. But this began when we stopped. When we allowed ourselves to just be there. Fully. Without trying to shape the moment. And that made everything feel different. Even time. Time didn't feel like something we needed to manage. It just moved. Naturally, without pressure, without urgency. And that's rare, because most of our lives are structured around time. Schedules, plans, deadlines. Even when we relax, there's often a part of us that's aware of what's next. Here, that wasn't there. And that absence created something valuable. Space to actually experience things, not rush through them. We eventually stepped out, walked around, not with a plan, just moving, observing. Noticing. The surroundings were calm. But more importantly, we were calm. And that made everything feel more connected. Not separate from us. Part of the experience. We didn't try to see everything. We didn't try to do everything. We just let the day unfold. And it did, naturally. We found places without searching, sat without planning, talked without forcing, stayed quiet without discomfort. And that rhythm became the entire experience. That night we sat again. Different place. Same feeling. And I realized something. Nothing about this felt new in a complicated way. It felt familiar. Like something we had already stepped into before coming here, and now we were just living it. Fully. That's when I understood what she meant that night. I just wanted to feel like it's really ours. This was it. Not because of where we were, because of how it felt. There was no outside influence shaping this experience. No expectations. No pressure to make it look a certain way. Just us. In a space that allowed us to be exactly as we are, and that's rare. Very rare. I also noticed something about myself. I wasn't thinking about anything else. Not work, not responsibilities, not what comes after. That part of my mind was quiet, not forced, naturally, because nothing was pulling it away from the present. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just a honeymoon. It was a reset. Not in a dramatic way. In a grounded way. A reminder of what things feel like when you remove unnecessary noise. And once you feel that, you don't forget it. You carry it. That's what I knew. This wasn't something that would stay here. This would come back with us, and how we move through things, and how we listen, and how we create space. Because now we had experienced it, together, and that changes something. Not loudly, quietly, permanently. As the days passed, nothing changed in a dramatic way. And that's what made it perfect. Because nothing needed to, it stayed the same. Steady, clear, real. And that consistency was exactly what we needed. Not a moment, not a highlight. An experience that didn't fade the moment it happened. Something that stayed. And for the first time, I understood what a honeymoon is actually supposed to be. Not something you remember because of what you did. Something you remember because of how it felt. And this felt exactly right. After a few days, I stopped thinking of it as a trip. That word didn't fit anymore. A trip feels temporary, like something you step into for a while and then step out of. It has a beginning and an end. You arrive, you experience, you leave. This didn't feel like that. It felt continuous, like something that had quietly blended into us instead of staying separate. I noticed it one morning. There was nothing special about that day. No plan, no activity waiting. Just another slow morning, the kind that had become normal here. We woke up without alarms, without any urgency. Light coming through the window, soft enough to not demand attention. She was already awake, sitting near the window. Not doing anything, just there. And for a moment, I didn't move. I just watched. Not in a dramatic way, just noticing something simple. There was no restlessness in her. No sign of what's next. No pressure to turn this quiet moment into something more. She was completely at ease with just being there, and that made me realize something. So was I. I wasn't thinking about the day. I wasn't planning anything in my head. I wasn't trying to make this moment meaningful. It already was. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about creating memories. It was about being present enough to let them form naturally, without trying, without forcing, without needing to label them as special. Because when you're fully there, even ordinary moments feel complete. We didn't say anything for a while. And it didn't feel like silence. It felt like understanding. Like there was nothing missing that needed to be filled with words. Eventually, she looked at me and smiled. Not a big smile, just a quiet one. The kind that doesn't ask for a response. And I understood it. Without needing to say anything back. That kind of understanding doesn't come from time alone. It comes from presence, from being in enough moments together where nothing needs to be explained. And this place, this experience, had created that space. Not by adding something, by removing everything unnecessary. That day we went out again. Walked slowly, without deciding where to go. And I noticed something different about how I was experiencing everything. I wasn't observing things as this place anymore. I wasn't separating the environment from us. It all felt connected. The surroundings, the air, the pace, the quietness. It all felt like part of the same experience. And we were part of it. Not visitors, not observers, just there. That's a subtle shift. But once you feel it, you notice the difference. Most of the time, when we travel, we stay slightly outside the experience. We look at things, we take them in. But there's always a small gap. Here, that gap wasn't there. We weren't looking at the moment, we were inside it. And that made everything feel more real. I also noticed how little we needed to do. There were no must-see places, no checklist, no pressure to make the trip worth it, because it already was. From the moment we arrived, and that removed something I didn't even realize I usually carry. That quiet pressure to maximize time, to make sure you don't miss anything, to turn every moment into something productive. That wasn't here. And without that pressure, everything felt lighter. Even the smallest things, sitting somewhere, walking without direction, watching nothing in particular, all of it felt enough, more than enough. That's when I understood something deeper. We didn't choose this place, we chose this feeling. And the place just matched it. That's why it worked. That's why it felt right from the beginning. Because we didn't come here expecting something from it. We came here ready to experience it. And that changes everything. I also realized something about time again. It wasn't just moving slowly. It felt irrelevant. Not in a careless way. In a freeing way. We weren't measuring it. We weren't dividing the day into parts. We weren't thinking about how much time we had left. We were just in it, and that made every moment feel full. Not stretched, not rushed, just complete. That's rare, because most of our lives are structured around time. But here, time didn't structure us. We just moved with it, and that made everything feel natural. I also noticed something about how we were together. There was no effort, no adjustment, no need to maintain anything. We weren't trying to be a certain way. We weren't trying to make the experience perfect. We were just ourselves. And that felt enough. That's when I understood something clearly. This isn't about where we came. It's about what we removed to get here. Noise, pressure, expectation. Once those were gone, everything else became simple. And that simplicity is what made this feel complete. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just right. That evening, as the day came to an end, I sat there again. Same calm, same stillness, and I realized something. I wasn't thinking about leaving, not because I didn't want to, because it didn't feel like something that would end. This feeling, this way of being, it didn't belong to this place. It belonged to us, and that meant we could take it with us. That's when everything settled, not in a big realization, in a quiet understanding. We didn't come here to create something temporary. We came here to experience something real. And once something real is experienced, it doesn't disappear. It stays. And how you think, and how you respond, and how you choose to move forward. That's what this had become. Not a memory. A shift. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed anything more than what was already there. Because what was there was complete. The last few days didn't feel like the end of something. That's what stayed with me. Usually when something is about to end, you can feel it. There's a subtle shift, a kind of awareness that time is running out. You start noticing things differently. Moments feel more fragile. There's a quiet urge to hold on to them, to make them last a little longer. But this didn't feel like that. There was no urgency, no pressure to capture anything before it slipped away. No need to turn the remaining time into something bigger. It felt the same as the first day. Steady, unchanged, complete. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't something we were about to lose, because it was never tied to the place. It was tied to how we were experiencing things, and that doesn't disappear when you leave. It stays. If you allow it to. I remember sitting there one evening, knowing we would be leaving soon. The thought was there. Clear. But it didn't carry any weight. It didn't feel like something ending. It just felt like something continuing in a different form. That's a different kind of awareness. One that doesn't create resistance. One that doesn't make you hold on tighter. It just allows things to move naturally. I looked at her. She didn't seem different either. No sadness. No attempt to stretch the moment. She was just present. the same way she had been since the beginning. And that consistency reminded me of something. Nothing about this experience was built on intensity. It was built on steadiness, and steadiness doesn't fade quickly. It carries. That's why it felt so stable, even now, even at the end. We didn't talk about how fast it went. We didn't say things like, I wish we had more time, because those thoughts didn't feel necessary. Nothing felt incomplete. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt like it was cut short. Everything felt finished in the right way. That's rare. Because most things end with a sense of almost, but this didn't. It felt whole. Not perfect. Just complete. That night we didn't do anything special. We didn't try to mark it as the last evening. We didn't change anything about how we had been. We just stayed in the same rhythm, the same pace, the same presence. And that made it feel even more real. Because nothing needed to be highlighted. Nothing needed to stand out. It was all already enough. I also noticed something about myself. I wasn't trying to remember everything. That surprised me. Because usually when something matters, you try to hold on to it. You try to memorize it, to make sure you don't forget. But I didn't feel that need, because I knew something. This wasn't something I needed to remember. This was something I had already absorbed. And there's a difference. Memories can fade. But experiences that change you stay. And this had changed something, quietly, deeply, permanently. I could feel it. Not in a dramatic way, in how I thought, in how I responded, in how I stayed present, without effort. That's when I understood something clearly. This honeymoon wasn't about creating memories to look back on. It was about experiencing something that becomes part of you moving forward. And that's exactly what this had become. The next morning, when we were getting ready to leave, everything felt simple. No rush, no stress, no last-minute urgency. We packed the same way we had lived here, calmly, without overthinking. And even in that moment, I could feel the same steadiness. Nothing had changed. Not even at the end. We stepped out, took one last look, not in a dramatic way, just acknowledging it. And then we left. No hesitation, no resistance, just moving forward. And that felt right. On the way back, I noticed something. The same quiet presence we had here was still there. It didn't disappear. It didn't fade once we left the place. It stayed in how we sat, in how we spoke, in how we didn't feel the need to fill silence. That's when it became completely clear. This was never about the destination. It was about what we allowed ourselves to experience. And once you experience something like that, you don't leave it behind. You carry it. That's what this was. Not a trip, not a phase, not something that ended. A shift. One that doesn't announce itself. One that doesn't demand attention, but one that stays. In everything that comes after. And as we moved back into our normal lives, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing needed to change for this to stay. We just needed to not forget what this felt like. And not recreate it, just allow it. The same way we did here, naturally. Without force. Without expectation. Just being present. Because in the end, that's all this was. And that's all it ever needed to be. And somehow that was enough. Coming back didn't feel like returning to something heavy. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually after any kind of break, there's a shift the moment you step back into routine. The same environment, the same responsibilities, the same patterns, they come back quickly. And with them, a certain weight returns too. Not always obvious, but present. This time, it didn't happen like that. Nothing around us had changed. But how it felt? Had. We stepped back into the same space we had left. But there was no sudden rush of thoughts, no immediate pressure to get back into everything. It all looked familiar, but it didn't feel overwhelming. It just was, and we were in it. The same way we have been in those quiet days. That's when I understood something clearly. The place hadn't created the feeling we had, and because of that, it didn't stay there. It came back with us. The first few days were slow, not because we planned them that way, because we didn't feel the need to rush back into everything. We handled what needed to be handled, spoke to people, caught up on small things. But even while doing all that, there was a kind of steadiness that stayed in the background, like a constant. Not loud, not something you think about, just there. I noticed it in small moments, the way we sat together without needing to talk. The way silence didn't feel like a gap that needed to be filled. The way conversations felt clear, without extra layers. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt rushed, and that made everything easier. I also noticed how I was thinking, or rather, how I wasn't. That constant mental movement, planning, anticipating, analyzing, it had reduced, not completely gone, but quieter, and that quietness made everything feel more manageable. Even things that usually feel heavy didn't carry the same weight. Not because they changed, because I wasn't reacting to them the same way. I was just responding, and that made a difference, a real one. I also realized something about time again. It still moved the same way. Nothing about the structure of the day had changed, but it didn't feel like something I was chasing anymore. It felt like something I was inside of, the same way it had felt there. And that made everyday life feel less like something to get through and more like something to experience. Even in simple moments, that's when it became clear. This wasn't something temporary. It wasn't a phase. It was a shift in how I moved through things. And once that shifts, everything else follows. I also noticed how we interacted with each other. Nothing dramatic changed, but everything felt clearer, more direct, more honest. We didn't carry small things unnecessarily. We didn't overthink simple situations. We didn't create tension where there didn't need to be any. We just understood. And that understanding didn't come from effort. It came from the space we had created and brought back. There were moments where life tried to move faster again. Calls, work, unexpected things, situations that usually create pressure, and I paid attention to how I responded. Not in a controlled way, just noticing. And I realized something. I didn't get pulled into that same rush immediately. There was a pause, a small one, but enough to stay grounded, enough to not react automatically. And that pause made all the difference, because in that pause, I had a choice, to rush or to stay steady. And more often than not, I stayed steady. That's something I didn't have before, or maybe I did, but I didn't use it. Now I did. Naturally. I also noticed something else. I didn't feel like I needed another break. That's rare, because usually after a trip you start thinking about the next one, planning it, looking forward to it. But this time, I didn't. Not because I didn't want to travel, because I didn't feel like I needed to escape anything. That's the difference. This didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a reset. And that reset stayed. So there was no urge to run away again. I could just be where I am. And that felt enough. I also realized something about what we experienced there. It wasn't something extraordinary. It wasn't something dramatic. It was simple. But it was real. And real things don't fade the same way dramatic things do. They settle. They become part of how you move. That's what this had become. Not a memory I look back on. A way I continue forward. Quietly. Without needing to remind myself. It just shows up. In how I pause. In how I listen. In how I respond. In how I don't rush to fill silence. In how I allow things to be what they are. And that changes everything. Not in a visible way. In a way that stays. That's when I understood something fully. The honeymoon didn't end when we came back. It just changed form. It moved from a place into us. And now, it exists in how we live. Not separately. As part of everything. And that's what made it real. Because anything real doesn't need to be held on to. It stays on its own. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to keep this feeling. I just knew it wasn't going anywhere. Because it wasn't tied to anything outside. It was already inside. And that was the most important part. After some time, something else became clear to me. The feeling didn't stay because I tried to hold on to it. It stayed because I stopped interfering with it. That's a subtle difference, but once you understand it, everything changes. In the beginning, after we came back, there was a part of me that was quietly aware of how things felt different. And naturally, there's always that small instinct to protect something when it feels right, to make sure it doesn't fade, to make sure nothing disrupts it. But I didn't act on that instinct. I didn't try to keep anything. I just continued. And that's what allowed it to stay. Because the moment you try to hold on to a feeling, you change it. You make it something to maintain, something to manage, something to control. And that's where it starts losing its natural flow. But this didn't need to be managed. It just needed to be allowed. And I understood that without needing to think about it too much. That understanding showed up in how I handled small things, moments that would usually create unnecessary tension, tiny misunderstandings, situations that, before, might have turned into something bigger than they needed to be. Now, they didn't. Not because I avoided them, because I didn't react to them the same way. I noticed something important. There was space between what happened and how I responded. That space wasn't forced. It was just there. And in that space, I had clarity. Not perfect clarity, but enough to not react automatically. Enough to choose a response instead of falling into a habit. That changed everything. Because most unnecessary problems don't come from situations. They come from how we react to them. And once that reaction slows down, everything else becomes easier to handle. I also noticed something about how we communicated. There was less noise, less over-explaining, less need to make everything perfectly clear in words. Not because we stopped talking, because we understood more without needing to say everything. That's what that time together had created. Not just closeness, understanding. And understanding reduces the need for constant explanation. That made everything feel lighter. Conversations weren't about proving a point, or making sure something was fully understood. They were just real, direct, uncomplicated. I also became more aware of what actually matters. That sounds simple, but it's not something we always live by. Before, small things used to feel important just because they were in front of me. Now I could see the difference. What actually deserves attention and what doesn't. That made decision-making easier, not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. I didn't spend time on things that didn't matter. I didn't give energy to situations that didn't require it, and that created more space. Space to focus on what actually matters, and what mattered most was simple. Us. Not in a heavy or demanding way, just in a real way. The way we move through things, the way we respond to each other, the way we keep things simple instead of making them complicated. That's what stayed at the center. And because of that, everything else stayed balanced. I also realized something else. Nothing about this required effort. That's important. Because when something requires constant effort to stay the same, it usually doesn't stay. But this didn't feel like something I had to work on. It felt like something I had already understood. And once you understand something deeply, you don't need to remind yourself of it constantly. It just becomes part of how you act. That's what this had become. Not a thought. A way of being. And that's what made it stable. I also noticed how little I was thinking about the honeymoon itself. Not because it didn't matter. Because it had already done what it needed to do. It wasn't something I needed to revisit constantly. It wasn't something I needed to compare with daily life. It had already integrated into how I think, into how I respond, into how I move through things. And that's what made it real, not something separate from life. Something that became part of it. I also became more comfortable with things not being perfect. That's another shift I hadn't noticed immediately. Before, there was always a small expectation that things should feel a certain way. Now, that expectation wasn't there. Things could be simple, things could be ordinary, and that was enough. Because I wasn't looking for something extra anymore. I wasn't trying to recreate a specific feeling, I was just present. And presence makes ordinary moments feel complete. That's what had changed, not the moments, how I experienced them. And that's something that doesn't fade easily, because it doesn't depend on external conditions, it comes from within. I also realized something about control. I didn't feel the need to control everything anymore, not outcomes, not situations, not even how things should feel. I just allowed things to be, and responded when needed. That created a kind of ease I hadn't felt before. Not because everything became easy, because I wasn't making it harder than it needed to be, and that's when everything settled into something stable, not exciting, not intense, just steady. And steady is what lasts. That's what I understood. This wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about removing what wasn't necessary, and once that was removed, everything else aligned on its own. That's what stayed with me. Not a memory, not a specific moment. A way of seeing things, a way of responding, a way of living that doesn't create unnecessary pressure, and that was more valuable than anything else, because it didn't end, it didn't fade, it just continued, naturally, without effort, exactly the way it began. After some time, I stopped noticing the change. Not because it disappeared, because it became normal. That's how you know something has truly settled into your life. When it no longer feels like something new, something different, something you need to pay attention to, it just becomes part of how you exist. That's what happened. There was no moment where I thought, yes, this is still there. I simply lived in it, quietly, naturally, without checking, without questioning. And that's when I understood the final piece of it. This was never about the honeymoon, not really. That trip didn't create something out of nothing. It revealed something that had always been possible, but needed the right space to be seen. And once seen, it didn't need to be recreated. It just needed to be lived. That's the difference. Most people think moments like that are rare because they depend on a place or time or situation, but that's not true. They feel rare because we rarely allow ourselves to slow down enough to experience them. That's what we did there. We slowed down. We removed the noise. We stopped trying to shape every moment. And in that space, everything became clear. And clarity, once felt, doesn't disappear. It stays in how you respond, in how you choose, in how you don't complicate what is already simple. That's what remained. Not the location, not the memory, the understanding. And that understanding changed how I see everything. Not dramatically, just enough to make things easier, more direct, more real. I don't rush the same way. I don't react the same way. I don't overthink things that don't need it. And most importantly, I don't look for something extra to make things feel complete, because now I know complete isn't something you create. It's something you recognize when nothing unnecessary is in the way. That's what we found. Not something new. Something real. And real things don't need to be held on to. They stay. In quiet ways. In everyday moments. In how you sit, how you listen, how you move through things without forcing them. That's where it lives now. Not in a place we visited. In us. And that's why it doesn't feel like something that ended. It feels like something that began and never needed an ending. Because we didn't bring something back from that trip. We brought ourselves back without everything that used to get in the way. And once you experience that, you don't try to go back to how things were before. You just continue forward. Lighter. Clearer. Together. And that is what made it complete.